All right, so let's discuss learning theory for martial arts. Now, there's not a specific learning theory for martial arts. And education and learning itself is a fairly young field, like 20th century young. Honestly, it's about the same age as sports science is. We just didn't really start educating ourselves on what this stuff was until somewhat very recently. So there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot that we're going on based on assumptions and the successes of a few. That being the case, though, what do we know, or what do we think we know? Certainly can't cover everything here. These are some clues that will help you kind of structure your journey for yourself as you go. So as usual, right, if I cite a paper, a study, some other resource, I will link it down below. So first we have to look at kind of psychology versus mechanism. So these things are intertwined, but in some regards they are also quite separate. So let's start with the psychology. On the psychology side, the basic things we're going to be looking for is kind of your risk management, your understanding of risk versus reward, which has a lot to do with your developmental years. And then that's going to be bolstered by reinforcement and punishment. Some of that will happen naturally, and some of that will happen, at the hands of your peers and your elders. Now, mechanistically, how the brain actually functions and assimilates new information, we can look at success versus failure, which is very similar to risk and reward, how contrast works, novelty, things like that, and even fatigue and recovery. So let's dig in on this. So let's start with risk versus reward. This is actually a pretty simple thing. So when we're in our developmental stage, when we're children, when we're infants, toddlers, children, we are introduced to this big bad world, and we have no reference points for anything. And our elders around us try their best, and sometimes not their best, to help give us that. But a lot of that is going to come through a process of self-discovery. Jonathan Haidt did a fantastic discussion on this developmental risk management at a university, and one of the things that he was talking about is we noticed that in the 90s, kids born in the 90s, there was a big crime wave at one point, and parents started kind of bringing the kids in closer, not letting them explore much, and we started seeing this cascade effect of trying to make the world safer by sheltering kids. Helicopter parenting became a thing. And then next thing you know, you just have these cascade effects of more and more sheltered kids. Well, by not learning risk and reward early during their developmental phase, it actually stunts their ability to learn it later. And they end up being extremely risk averse. And in the face of risk, end up becoming emotionally unstable. And thus, you get a lot of the complaining to authority figures and so on with this, because they don't learn how to solve problems themselves, right? And this goes back to kind of the discovery learning theory, which some people don't like, some people do like. But the idea is that when you learn through play and self-discovery, you learn this is beneficial, this is not beneficial, because there are direct consequences for my actions. That is a huge, huge thing. And so when you understand risk of consequences and rewards are technically still consequences. Consequence, right, comes after. And what we're talking about then is actually learning risk management so that we don't just shut down and try to make somebody else solve the problem for us because we do not have the capacity to solve the problem ourselves. So psychologically speaking, it is very, very important to instill a mindset of problem solving, of take the risk because there's a potential reward on the other side, consequences be damned. Obviously that needs to be tempered, right? there is a place and time for intervention when critical failures outweigh minor failures, right? So we don't want to completely just run wild with this. We don't want to let kids stick forks in electrical sockets, but at the same time, it is a massive part of learning to allow a kid or an adult to make mistakes and learn risk and reward. And you have the elders, the authority figures, whatever, step in and help guide them through that as counselors so that they understand, hey, the bad thing happened, but hey, you're still here. You didn't die. Let's just keep going and make things better and learn from our mistakes. So psychologically speaking, learning problem solving, learning risk management really, really aids in your ability to learn, because essentially you don't end up quitting as fast. So the other psychological piece that we need to look at is reinforcement and punishment. Now, one of the things, and this bugs me, is that people conflate negative reinforcement with punishment, and it's not actually the same thing at all. There's some overlap, but not in the way you might think. So positive and negative are essentially mathematical here. You're either adding something or taking it away. Positive, adding; negative, taking away. Reinforcement is trying to bolster, to increase the incidence of certain behavior. Punishment is trying to decrease certain amounts or certain types of behavior. Positive reinforcement means rewarding somebody for good behavior. Good in this case being the thing we're trying to increase, right? Negative reinforcement is actually removing consequence or removing punishment for good behavior. So in both cases, what we're trying to do is saying, if you do good, you will get a benefit. Either that benefit is gaining something, or that benefit is losing something negative, losing something that is detrimental. Punishment, however, is basically saying, okay, positive punishment is you will be punished. You will reap a negative consequence for doing something that is determined as non-beneficial. Negative punishment is actually going to be removing a reward. So negative punishment is basically removing reward, right? They go kind of in this way. Positive punishment, right, goes this way. So you're either trying to increase or decrease behavior by either adding or subtracting something. And we do this, again, this is a part where sometimes this naturally happens between our peers and between our elders. And just nature in general. Sometimes you are naturally rewarded or you are naturally punished, or, like, hey, pain stops when I do a thing. I should keep doing that thing, right? Those are really, really useful cues. And again, that goes into that risk and reward, risk management, problem solving mentality that you need to understand, that needs to start really, really, really early. There's only so much you can do as an external person to the individual to guide that. And that's really all you can do, is you kind of guide it. But the discovery has to be on the part of the other person. There seems to be a connection between the process of choosing to pursue a subject, choosing information, identifying information for yourself, discovering something for yourself. There seems to be a strong correlation with that and long-term recall, being able to remember a thing. The things that we do for ourselves seem to stand out more than the things that other people give us. And I don't understand the mechanism for that, but that seems to be the way it works. All right, now speaking of mechanisms, let's move on to mechanism. All right, I had to change camera and microphone, so I apologize if there's an abrupt change in quality here. Let's go on and discuss some of the mechanisms behind what's actually happening when learning happens. Now, we're not going to actually be talking about creating the new synapses in the brain, how many repetitions it takes or anything like that. That's still largely up in the air, being studied and all that. But we can talk about some of the other mechanistic things that seem to be happening. So we can look at success and failure first, because this is kind of the low-hanging fruit that we need to be looking at. And the biggest thing with success and failure is both sides of this are important, right? Just like we talked about reinforcement and punishment, risk and reward, success and failure are both important parts of this. Now, there's a lot of research saying that failure is super important. Now, failure is extremely important because of something that happens mechanistically. Psychologically speaking, if somebody shuts down because they have poor risk management skills and decide, and just becomes demoralized from failure, that's a whole separate issue. If somebody is in the process of learning and they fail, and then the mistake is identified, especially if they identify it themselves, and then they correct for that mistake, the lesson becomes more salient. This probably has something to do with contrast and novelty. In fact, a study in 2017 showed that if the error itself was more strongly believed in, right, the more conviction they had in the erroneous answer to whatever the problem was, when they are corrected, that correction becomes much stronger and the information sticks out more. And it probably has something to do with novelty, with contrast. So this brings us up to that other point that I wrote down earlier, that this concept of contrast or novelty. One of the things that we think we know when it comes to learning is there are these observable effects called the recency and primacy effects. And so it ends up looking kind of like, on a time scale, right? You have the beginning and you have the end, and you have this kind of smiley face dip. And what happens is the things that you start off with at the beginning, because everything it's new, it's beginning, it's the thing you started with, they tend to stand out more because it's where you started, right? You can actually point to like, oh, the thing began and this is where we started, and your brain picks up on that because it stands in contrast. Now, as the presentation, the lesson, whatever it is, goes on, the information starts sagging, right? You lose kind of track of time. There's maybe a bit of a dulling of the senses per se. If it drones on for too long, the sag gets more and more drastic, and you just lose a lot of that information because it no longer stands out. You're just in the mode and you're just riding it along. And this is one of the things that this is one of the reasons why as you get older, time feels like it passes by faster, because most of us as we get older fall into a routine. We tend to be more the same every day than different, which tends to make our brain shortcut our memory and go, well, it's the same as the other thing, so we don't have to remember it. It doesn't stand out. And so the things that don't stand out as much tend not to get remembered as much. And then, of course, the same thing happens on the primacy effect, the thing most recently learned, right? There's a proximity to the information. And again, you're correlating that with the end of it. You're correlating it with something that stands out. The beginning and end stand out more than the middle. And so there's this concept of contrast. And that's really what novelty is too, is it's contrast. And so when you've made a mistake, and you identify the mistake and you correct for the mistake, what happens is you've created a moment of contrast, and that contrast is much more easily remembered because it stands out. And that's really all we're looking at there. So mechanistically, what we're talking about when we're talking about learning from mistakes, learning from failures, provided they are not super critical, provided you don't get demoralized and you quit. Quitting is as bad as never starting. Provided you don't have that negative psychological reaction, provided you don't fall into cognitive dissonance where you dig deeper into the mistake because, well, hey, admitting I was wrong is bad. Well, provided you don't have those psychological reactions, then you're going to be looking for that contrast, and that is what failure offers you. Now, if you're on a string of failures and you're starting to feel fatigue from that, getting a sudden success is going to create another thing kind of like this. It's going to create another standout moment. Too much of the same thing all runs together. It creates a dulling of the senses. It creates a dulling of the memory, because things that are more the same are just not as easily remembered. Things that stand out are more easily remembered. So when you dot things in with successes and failures, when you have considerable amounts of novelty or other high contrast moments, you're going to remember them more. And that is a really, really critical part of learning, is creating that contrast. Now, something that we're talking about here, again, this goes to some degree with the contrast, but really what we're talking about, right? We talk about droning on for too long. There's also a sense of fatigue that comes into that. And this is where we start relating it to things like physical training, where there's kind of a fatigue and recovery balance that we have to look at as well. When we're looking at fatigue and recovery, what we have to understand is that everything that we do to exist in the three-dimensional space that we call reality costs us energy. Being alive costs us energy, and doing anything beyond merely existing costs us more energy. One of those general rules of reality is nature always seeks a path of least resistance. This goes back to entropy, right? Entropy is really just everything is trying to even out and be completely flat, no energy struggle. That's the simplest way that I can put it. Entropy is essentially the heat death of the universe. There will be no friction, no movement, no life. Entropy is death. Entropy is the enemy of reality. And so because of that, and because life seems to just want to keep on living for no other reason, no other discernible biological, physiological, physics reason than to simply continue living. Life wants to keep on living, path of least resistance. What do we end up with? Well, we end up with kind of this fatigue thing where our biological systems let us know, hey, you're consuming more energy than you're taking in, and it's going to start wearing you down. You're going to lose some of the effect of the training, of the learning. And so the very fact that exercising your brain, learning new information, is actually putting that cognitive load, is actually putting stress on you. Your nervous system will fatigue out, and you are essentially going to stop learning at a point. This is one reason why marathon cram sessions are not generally a good idea, because even if you make them last short term, they don't tend to transfer to long term very well. Individuals are different, but on the whole, they tend not to transfer very well. So you want to make sure that things are put into little bite-sized pieces. And remember what we talked about, that recency and primacy thing. Well, when you break things up into shorter sessions, what you end up with having is you have short little blocks that don't produce a ton of fatigue, and they're highly productive because you have closer recency and proximity effects, which means if we look at that as a tightrope, there's more tension on the tightrope, which means that the information is at a higher level and we remember it better because there's less sag in the middle, dipping us down to that point where we go below the threshold of memorizing things. That's a really, really critical thing. And then there's the recovery side of it. You need time for the actual physical new synapses, right? The new pathways that you're grooving in to actually take hold and settle and go from short term to long term. One of my favorite analogies is it's like eating food, right? If the learning is a lot like putting the food in your mouth and chewing and all of that, it's going home and resting and recovering and allowing that information to kind of just ruminate and do its thing becomes kind of the digestion process, right? And that's one of the simplest, easiest ways, at least in my perspective, on how to look at learning. Is, you're not going to get anything out of it if you put the food in your mouth, you chew it up, and then you just spit it out. or if it completely bypasses the digestion phase, like when you eat too much and you give yourself the runs, that's like, neither of those situations are good, right? If you take in the information and then you eject the information because your body can't handle it, then that information, that learning session was essentially wasted. So you wasted your time and you felt like you were doing something, but you kind of wasted your time because, you ate too much, you ate the wrong thing, whatever. And it's so much how this learning thing works. So not only do you want to take smaller bite-sized pieces, but you want to give it the time to digest. And this is actually one of the places where variation is really, really strong. So if we go back to talking about success and failure, there's one more thing we need to talk about. We need to talk about the concept of variation. So variation in the exercise, there's at least one study that I'm aware of, and I know I've got it bookmarked somewhere. I'll see if I can find the link. But there was at least one study showing that when people were given a task, and I think this was a computer-oriented task with like mouse clicks or something like that, but anything that's got kind of a tactile component at least, having variation in the lesson actually helped them learn more thoroughly. And the reason for that seems that in altering some of the variables in small ways where the task is still fairly specific, but you're doing things like changing the tempo or changing the intensity, something simple like that. When it shows that people are learning more thoroughly, it may have everything to do with the fact that it's giving them more opportunity to identify mistakes and kind of more concretely understand where the success zone is. It's essentially tightening up their margins. We see this in weightlifting as well. People who have more variation in their weightlifting tend to, in the long run, get stronger overall. And why might this be? Well, it may have something to do with this success and failure thing, where by giving more opportunity to identify errors and correct for them, what you end up with is a clearer picture of where the margins are. And because the margins are highly specific to you and your circumstances, that's a really necessary part of all this. So, the success is important, right? Success gives you a clear definition of this is the goal and this is how we get there. This is the path we take to get to the goal. The problem is when you say, here's the goal, here's the path, and the margins aren't defined, it's really easy to wander off the path, right? Because everything is fuzzy. And by going through failures, by identifying, by actually committing errors, mistakes, and by identifying and correcting for them, what you do is you tighten up those margins and you start grooving that path. And there's always going to be some margin, but all you're doing, right, is tightening up those margins so you have a clearer picture of the path to success. And again, as long as we're warding off those psychological enemies of cognitive dissonance and demoralization, then we can use both failure and success as a way to both clearly define the goal and to identify the margins within which that goal can be achieved. And it's massively, massively useful for understanding things, right? Nobody walks onto a martial arts mat and just instantly succeeds at everything. They make little errors and, oh, why isn't this technique working today? Oh, well, the coach comes around and goes, oh, you need to move 3 degrees, right? Sometimes you figure it out for yourself, right? Sometimes you just, you're struggling, and accidentally one thing clicks and your partner goes, wow, that worked. What'd you do? You go, well, I moved this way. Let's try that again, right? It's that experimental tinkering procedure, right? Nassim Taleb likes to talk about heuristics, and really what he's talking about is bottom-up tinkering. You start with an idea, you start with a plan, an algorithm, a heuristic, whatever you want to call it. You start with a model, and then you tinker with it until the margins tighten up and become more specific to your circumstance. And that's really how this stuff works. So you see, when we're talking about learning, what we're really talking about is both a psychological side of essentially risk management and problem solving, and we're talking about a mechanistic side of how we actually adopt new information. Now, one thing else that I should mention is just something that I learned a long time ago. I don't actually have a study for this, but it seems to be true, so take it with a grain of salt. But it seems that we are more readily accepting of new information when we can pin it to other information that we already know or think we know, things that we are confident in. When we can go, I'm confident in this, and this seems to follow along these lines, we tend to more readily accept it. So there's the novelty and contrast, but it also has to be familiar to a degree. And when you're dealing with something that is completely foreign, you have to start translating to create familiarity, even if it's an artificial familiarity, and it really, really helps. All right, so I think that's all I'm going to say on learning theory for martial arts, right? And there's so much more ground to be covered when it comes to this, and actual program design and all that. There's so much to be said on this. But I just wanted to give you guys a quick primer on how to do these things so you can kind of structure things and try to avoid what we call in the weightlifting world junk volume. Doing a lot of volume of something that's not actually going to be productive or beneficial. Again, using that analogy of eating, right? If it makes you puke, if you spit it out, if it gives you diarrhea, it's not doing you any good. You have to have not just the intake process, but the proper digestion process for you to actually absorb the nutrition of the information that you're bringing in. So, and that's where that quote, right? Absorb what's useful, reject what's useless, and add what's uniquely your own. That's kind of what that's alluding to. And, so let's try to press forward in a more evidence-based way. Let's also understand that there's a lot of room for individualization here, because not just personal preference, but personal individual characteristics are going to determine a lot of this. We can paint big broad strokes, but every model we create is essentially wrong and has to be tailored to the person. They might be starting points, but they have to eventually be tailored to the individual. So with that, I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, give the dog a bone. You can follow us on our other social media accounts, and if you really like us, you can head over to Amazon and buy a shirt. You can also go over to Gumroad and purchase some of our instructional courses. All of the links will be provided and also on our website. If you happen to be in the Phoenix area, we would love to meet you. Come drop in for a class, even just to chat. And if you're looking for a new home, we would be happy to have you. So until next time, good journey.